Hi, I'm Sami, and this is the Career Kickstart Show. I'm excited because I got Nancie Vito on the show, and that is Nancie with the C-I-E, not a C-Y. So we got a very unique Nancie on the show. She is the owner and founder of Flourish with Nancie, and she's going to talk to us all about burnout and how we can prevent it and how we can truly nip what feels like one of the most millennial of the afflictions right now. And she's on a mission to guide her clients in finding joy, getting out of their own way, and creating a life they love. So, Nancie, I know that you got a bunch of stuff. I've seen your website. You got a lot of titles. You've done a lot of things. How about you kind of share a little bit more about you, since I know I'm barely even scratching the surface?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And Sami, thanks so much for having me on. I am technically a life coach, but ultimately I help people, like you said, design their life based on really what feels good to them. I help people prevent burnout. And my background is actually in public health and mental health. So I, in my former life, worked on a lot of depression research studies, depression education, suicide prevention trainings, things like that. And I actually got to the point where I was a little burnt out. And once I got myself to a point where I learned more and more about this whole concept of human flourishing and things you can do for yourself to get yourself in a better place in life, then I was, better positioned to help people do the same. So yeah, I enjoy working with folks. A lot of people that I work with do work in corporate positions or some sort of position where they're either on the brink of burnout or they're thinking about doing something different. And I also work a lot with folks who want to get out of that corporate scene and kind of do their own thing and create something for themselves in terms of entrepreneurship.
Oh, awesome. You know what? When you were talking, I really saw a lot of my own journey because I worked for AIDS Foundation as a employment specialist in like a downtown high-risk drop-in center. And before I started my entrepreneur journey, I was just so burned out of it. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. And it sounds like when you're dealing with some of these folks who are going from corporate to entrepreneur or they're switching into entrepreneurship, do you find that you kind of have to work with them on dealing with their initial burnout before you even get to some of the business aspect? How does that work? Because I know I had lots of lingering burnout when I went from nonprofit to entrepreneurship. So it wasn't very relaxing, I guess.
No. Oh, I hear you. I had a similar background, kind of nonprofit, a lot of social service type positions, and folks who I work with in that realm, and really in any realm, whether it's, nonprofit or healthcare or whatever it might be, or in a corporate setting, if they are going that different route, either with entrepreneurship or even simply changing jobs, it is necessary to deal with those burnout symptoms, because ultimately what happens if you're already at that burnout stage, then more than likely you're exhausted. And if you're exhausted, you're less likely to be able to take action and inspired action. So there are things you can do to kind of get yourself at least back to baseline. Of course, the goal is to thrive, right? Ultimately. But if you're already at that burned out stage, the goal, of course, is to prevent, which, prevention is my major focus. But if you're already at that burnout phase, then you have to deal with that, because you're not going to have the energy to do ultimately what you want. Because you can have all these intentions and dreams and goals, yet if you don't have the energy to take any steps, and of course it's going to require consistent action and consistent steps, then you're going to feel like you're spinning your wheels and it's not your fault,
Oh yeah, you got to get that hard reset, just like a laptop.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about burnout. Now, describe what it is for people who are listening who might not be sure, because we hear that term all the time. Who's most at risk for burnout?
Yeah. There's mixed research on that. I am kind of a research nerd, by the way.
Love it.
There's there are certainly some articles that say if you're more introverted, then, you are going to be at a higher risk for burnout. Of course, there's some self-care strategies you need to put into place, which we can certainly talk about. And as a fellow introvert, by the way, I know it's doable, so I don't want anyone to be like, oh no, I'm doomed, And also the people who are in any kind of helping profession could be at high high risk, especially the type of position, Sami, that you were mentioning in terms of helping other people who are at high risk. I know that culture, and it could be very high pressure, low pay, long hours sometimes. But then there's also certain professions, like attorneys have high burnout rate, physicians, but then personality wise, if you're a little bit more on the introverted side, if you're more neurotic, if you're really, really a perfectionist, then that could cause some burnout as well. There's of course some pluses and minuses to perfectionism, but there's definitely some risk for burnout if you're working, 18-hour days because you just want to get every detail just right.
Oh, wow. And I also see it a lot with tech professionals and people who are in startup cultures. It's like they can't stop ever.
And you're exactly right. Definitely with some tech cultures. And I know we'll probably focus a lot today on what we can do as individuals. I do want to throw in there that there's a lot that organizations can do. So sometimes it has a lot to do with the organizational culture, which of course tech companies and startups can play into that as well. Like if everybody's working 14-hour days, then you might not feel right leaving at 6 p.m. if everyone else is staying late and that's the norm. Or if everyone is expecting you to return emails, if the boss emails you at 9:30 or 10, even though it's not really an emergency, if the organization culture is just to always be on call, then certainly that can come into play as well. So sometimes that's the situation in my experience from what I've seen with tech as well.
Yeah, it affects so many people, but it affects them differently. Can you talk about maybe some symptoms and how it can affect you either in the workplace or in your own business?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few hallmark symptoms, if you want to call them symptoms. There's kind of some symptoms that are pretty general, kind of across the board. And that's the exhaustion, which we've mentioned, just emotional exhaustion especially. Another one is depersonalization, which basically is you're disengaging yourself from your work. Like sometimes if you're burned out, you just are done. And I know we've all, or maybe not all, but I know I've been there where you're just over it, you're done. You've taken a step back and you almost start to see the people as problems. This can tie in a lot with healthcare and nonprofit work too, where you're there to help people. And then you just like, oh no, you start to see your clients as like, oh man, which of course is not good for anybody. That's also compassion fatigue that can tie into that as well. And then basically you start to see your efficiency decrease. So you're not as productive. You start to see mistakes. And you're right, it can show up differently for folks. Those are the main three signs that you're already kind of at that burnout stage. Now there's some precursors to that. Like if you're constantly overwhelmed and you're at this really high level of stress for a long period of time, it's like overwhelm is the precursor almost. Like, we can only take so much. Our bodies and our minds can only take so much until we just get to that point, that I hate to call it a breaking point, but sometimes if we're just going without taking a step back and taking some breathers, and of course self-care can come into play as well, then we could possibly be at risk for some of those symptoms. And I hate for it to sound so clinical, but for it to be kind of the exhaustion and the depersonalization, the diminished performance, which is basically just start to see our work go downhill sometimes, and then we start making mistakes. Now, for other people, it could be trouble concentrating, again, the fatigue, or it could show up as irritability. Like you can come home and just snap at your partner or your kids or your dog, for no apparent reason other than you're just over it.
Yeah. And, you go home, you're feeding your cat, and suddenly you're in an argument. And of course, the cat's going to win. The cat's always going to win.
Cats, of course.
And I've noticed that a lot with a lot of millennials. When you graduate during a recession, you're always kind of fighting. And I know that a lot of folks have been doing that for a long time. So let's get to the meat of the matter and let's talk about how do you help people rise above? Like, what are some things that you can do?
Yeah. So on an individual level, the main thing we have to keep in mind is awareness. And I know that's super basic, but sometimes we just get on autopilot and we don't realize what we're doing. If we're not realizing that we're just going without being aware and mindful of the pace that we're going at, then we can certainly be heading down that burnout path. But if we kind of make it a habit to check in with ourselves, kind of create that ideal week, of course, work is unpredictable, but if we kind of plan out ahead of time, like, all right, when am I going to put in, I don't know, whether it's a workout or something that brings us joy, like things that nourish our souls. We have to remember to do those things because ultimately we want to have fun, right? So we want to schedule in fun. Like, sometimes we can get in that mode of just work, especially in tech. Like you said, there's always deadlines, or in a lot of careers, it's just high pressure, long hours. And then we just want to come home and veg in front of the TV, which can help sometimes, yet other times it just ends up, we just feel yucky, but we want to remember what is it that brings us joy, schedule in those activities, but also little things during the day. Like a lot of times there's a series of small steps that we can take, like during the day. If we're not taking breaks, just make it a point to even take a 5 or 10 minute walk around the block, take a lunch break. I can't tell you how many people I speak with who just eat lunch at their desk and just eat through lunch. You have to give your mind a rest. If you're multitasking while you're eating, our brains are just going to be on overload. And of course, that's when the mistakes start happening. And, we become more and more inefficient, even though we think that putting in more hours or longer hours is going to help. It oftentimes backfires from what I've seen. But ultimately, when I had a desk job, I had created this routine of sorts. Not an obvious where everyone would know my routine, but I would get up in the afternoon and make myself hot herbal tea and had this little essential oil roll on, just to kind of check in with myself so that I wasn't always just staring at my screen for hours and hours and hours, just kind of some little things. And then social support at work is helpful as well. Now, it's helpful to have friends at work who you can have conversations with and vent. Now, of course, if it just becomes a venting all the time and not very productive, where you just bring each other down, you just have to tap into yourself, tap into, okay, how is this making me feel? But oftentimes just having friends at work is helpful, but ultimately changing the way you work is going to be the biggest thing. Not only creating those nourishing activities and maybe taking deep breaths or walks during the day, but again, how is it that you're working? Are you immediately sending back that email at 10 p.m. when it's really not necessary? Is it something that can wait in the morning? I really think that a lot of times we teach people how to treat us, and that to me is the perfect example of, if it's not an emergency and if it really could wait till the next morning, turn off your notifications at a certain time. That's just one of the biggest things that I've seen to help people. And it's such a small thing. I can throw out 20 more things, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Is it something where you think that, because a lot of this sounds like where people get into that habit of being busy or feeling comfortable when they're busy, do you find that people have resistance to the slowdown? We have a culture that kind of prizes productivity. Your worth is what you produce. And when you're trying to consciously take a step back so you can focus more on the quality of what you're producing than the quantity, does that freak people out? Does that flip their gourds?
Yes, it does. You're right. A lot of it has to do with culture. We're in this culture where it's busy, busy, busy is good, where it's actually the opposite. More and more research that's coming out. There was one study done at Stanford that after so many hours a week, we actually are less productive. But I see that especially with the entrepreneurs. It's kind of like this opportunity cost. We feel oh man, if we're not doing something right now, then I might be losing out on money, or I might be losing out on this, opportunity or client or new project or whatever it might be. But yes, and it's quite the opposite, because first of all, busy doesn't necessarily equal productive, right? So there's certain things we can put into place where we make our days more efficient. And if we are productive and efficient, then, that's a whole different story than working 14-hour days where half the time we're on Facebook and just kind of numbing out because we're just exhausted. Our brains can only concentrate for so long, right? For just an intense periods of time. But you're right. We have this sense of, oh no, if I'm not busy right now, then I must not be being productive. But it's really, if we give ourselves permission to take breaks, then we ultimately end up being more productive. And I know we're probably all oh yeah, we get that concept, but really to implement it makes a huge difference. Again, the mistakes will start going away. Your quality of work actually increases if you actually have better productivity and efficiency but you give yourself time to rest. Of course, sleep is huge. Give yourself permission to actually like have a nice sleep routine. I mean, I was just recently working with a client, a woman in her early 30s, a perfectionist, would stay up all hours of the night unnecessarily to get her work done for her job. And ultimately, this is exactly what she was seeing, like in terms of, I don't have time to not work. I have to do that to get it all done. But ultimately, sure enough, things were coming back to her with mistakes. And, she ultimately was, hearing it from her boss and her colleagues that the mistakes were going up and the quality of work had gone down. So some of this is mindset stuff, right? In terms of changing the way we think about work, in terms of that we always have to be busy and that everything has to be perfect. Of course, we can have high standards, but sometimes it's a shift in thinking and thinking about, all right, if we're so worried about getting this done on time and thinking, I'm not going to get this done, I'm not going to get this in for this deadline, then you can take a step back and say, is that really true? Like, have I ever missed a deadline? My quality of work is really high. My boss likes my work. I get along with my colleagues. So sometimes we have this high level of stress that we're causing ourselves in terms of stress and overwhelm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And when we are thinking about how we can kind of slow down and chill out, I feel like it becomes kind of a burden for some folks. And we're like, oh, but now I got to heal myself and I have to do this and that. And it makes us feel farther away. So you've listed out so many good ideas for how to de-stress and chillax and just get your little baby Buddha on for healing and wellness. But how about before we start wrapping up the interview, how about you give me just a tip for flourishing so you can feel like, maybe you're doing the prevention and stuff like that. Maybe you're doing some healing, but something you can do where you feel like you're flourishing.
Yeah, just a simple thing. Of course, I know we've heard so much about gratitude, and it really does make a difference. It helps you shift your mindset. But if you think about just setting the tone for the day, like sometimes we get up in the morning and we're just so focused on, we got to get to work. We have this commute. We might grab something on the way out to eat, But when we wake up, give ourselves like 15 minutes extra, first of all, but then just really think about what it is that you are grateful for. It can help set the tone for the day. It's such a little small thing. It's micro stuff, really. But when we start to retrain how we think about things, and then at the end of the day, think about what are 3 things that went well today? Because oftentimes what causes overwhelm is all of those things that we think about that we still have to do and that we didn't get done, or the things that we feel didn't go well. Yet if we think about at the end of the day, 3 things that we feel went well, even if it's, hey, I got to play with this puppy today, or I had this really sweet conversation with the cashier at the grocery store, then that can help us remember those good things that happen versus like, oh my gosh, I still have 10 things to do and I don't think that meeting went well. So
yes, I love it. Simple but powerful. Now, thank you for sharing. Micro tips are great. So now that we've heard so much from you and we've had a good discussion, how about before we end this, let everybody know where they can find you online. The folks at home want to know more about Flourishing. How do they do it? How do they work with you more?
Yeah. So the best way to find me is my website. And if you know how to spell my name, then you're golden. It's Nancie with an I-E. Like you said, it's Nancie. And last name is Vito, V like Victor, I-T-O. So it's nancievito.com. And I do have like a freebie little mini guide in there for those of you who might be thinking of bigger picture questions in terms of intentions for your life. Of course, sometimes we do have to check in with ourselves and trust our gut and make a decision where, we might not even be where we want to be. So feel free to download that and hop on my newsletter list. And then also, if you go to nancievito.com/burnout, since we've been talking about that today, I also have a little mini course there. Feel free to sign up for that as well.
Awesome. Sounds like there's a lot to be had at nancievito.com. So thank you, Nancie, for being on the show. It was great talking to you today.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it. It was fun.
Awesome. And thank you all. It's always great to be able to give you some hot, juicy information from some great experts. So thank you guys. And as always, I'm Sami Gardner, and this is the Career Kickstart Show. Bye. Change your career, change your life at CareerKickstartAcademy.com.